What are we here for today? So it's basically a talk about a guide. What is computational reproducibility? And in this talk, I'll try to give an overview about a model or an idea what reproducibility could be from a conceptual point of view. What are the typical hurdles to achieve that, and maybe some ideas on how to overcome it. But first and foremost, let's introduce myself a little bit, that you know who is presenting today. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Computational Social Science, and I work there in the team TSA. I have seen that some of my colleagues are there today, and I'm sure maybe they have some questions after that as well. If they want to introduce them, that's just fine for me. And with that being said, maybe what is a good point to start? Let's start with what is actually computational reproducibility, or what is reproducibility in the first place? So what is reproducibility? It's the ability to obtain consistent results independently, repeating a study and using the same data, methods and analysis. So basically, if someone else would do that, you would arrive at the same results, right? So you would find the same, it's invariant basically of who is the conductor of a study, right? So that's what you want to achieve. And computational reproducibility really focuses on the computational aspects. It's the ability to reproduce numerically comparable results, and the emphasis is here on comparable. It does not necessarily be exact the same results, since there might be, for example, some differences introduced with respect to, for example, numerical uncertainty and these kinds of things. But comparable results using the same data, same code, that's also very important, and implementing the same computational methods. Those are basically the two important things we will be talking about and focusing on the later one, namely computational reproducibility. But why it really matters? So scientific progress depends on findings that can be verified. So others can say, I disagree, I have a different finding. Extended, so you can build on. And there should be also some way that introduces some trust, right? So that you have the ability, if you read something, that you know others have tested that, and I can trust it in a way that others can verify what has been done. However, replication crisis, already like a few years now, really renewed attention if that is really the case, in particular in the behavioral and social sciences, but it came originally from psychology. So computational social science adds really a lot of complexity there, since you basically have social scientists in many cases that also need to have additional skills, right? Furthermore, there might be things such as dependence on external factors such as API, hardware constraints, and all these things which limit reproducibility in the computational sense, right? But I think, and I guess there's broad agreement hopefully, that it's really important to have computational reproducibility if you want to have that idea that we can build up on research and build up a cumulative body of work, right? So, and the core idea is really like paper is more trustworthy if it can be more credible, if it can be verified. If it cannot be verified, then you basically have just text. That's really the important point here. And the main product actually of our research, even though we think it's a paper, but actually the paper should be more or less like a report on what we did, right? So the core is actually the actual research that we did. And to make that available, we need computational reproducibility. But there's also something, and I've already hinted to it, especially for CSS. So in CSS, meaning here Computational Social Sciences, we rely in many cases on large and potentially like messy data sets, right? So think about like social media platforms where there are many gigabytes of data, and these data have to be cleaned in the first place and all these kinds of things. Furthermore, computational social science, there is a lot of like innovation, but also a lot of variance with respect to different analysis steps, different methodology. Almost every paper or many paper are actually papers or publications that aim at introducing new methodology. And if a reader wants to use it, you really want to be able to access it, methodology and the code that implements it as easy as possible or as simple as possible. And we need reproducibility for that, right? The next thing is, I've already pointed to that before, there are many APIs around where our research relies on. Just think about, like, for example, there used to be a platform called Twitter, which was almost completely open with respect to APIs, and then step by step that got closed down more and more. And if you've published your results like 10 years ago and said you just need to go over to that RPE, people might still love your paper and they think it's a great paper, but they are unfortunately no longer having access to that data since the API is closed, gone, or otherwise not available, right? And last but not least, if we talk about reproducibility, in the computational sense, you also need to think about questions such as where actually can you run these computations. In the computational social sciences, we in many cases have extensive storage and compute requirements, right? So at the end of the day, what does it lead us to? It leads us to the situation that actually there's a larger surface as compared to the traditional social sciences with respect to ending up in a situation of irreproducibility, where people may have the code, may have a very nice description, but end up in front of a Twitter or X now API that's no longer available, removing from them the access to the data and limiting computation, or basically turning something completely irreproducible. So that's why we really need to care in computational social sciences, or in particular in computational social sciences, about reproducibility. When I talk about reproducibility, there are frequently coming up different concepts, right? So if someone talks, for example, about the replication crisis, is it the same thing as reproducibility? Or if something is reproducible, is it then robust, right? I've also mentioned before things such as we can build potentially on stuff. And actually, those are different concepts, but they're related. And the main axes, or the main dimensions of relatedness are using the same data, but same analysis, then you would be talking really about reproducibility, where we really hope to arrive at the same results. And for computational reproducibility, that would be the hope for numerical identical results, right? But you could still also say, yes, let's see if you have the same data, but a different analysis implementation that we go about. And that would be basically robustness, right? So we change something a little bit in the methodology, and then we want to know how robust our findings are with respect to potentially different analysis. And the other dimension is if we have different data, right? So if you want to see if our results hold, given that we use a different data set. So for example, can a finding be replicated on a data set for a different country? But then we are talking about replication, right? And again, here, the other dimension, you can replicate something using the same analysis method, but a different data set. For example, on a different country or different time potentially. But if we talk about different data set and different analysis method, then it's really about generalization. So we really modify both factors. And what you can think about really is a factorial model where you have like a data set, and then as a second factor there is your analysis. And data times analysis basically should produce the results. If the first two factors are identical, so same analysis, same data, you would hope for the same results, right? And then you are in the reproducible. And this is really the main thing what we will focus here in the talk about, even though the others are as important and certainly also very interesting. Today we are talking here about the reproducibility, same analysis and the same data part. So now that we have delineated it a little bit, like let's think about what basically goes into that recipe for achieving that computational reproducibility and what is necessary for that, right? So first of all, let's think about so we are really talking about what a researcher shares so that something becomes reproducible. And so it's a point of publication where we look into, is it reproducible? But that's only the point where we look into if it's reproducible. Obviously, there need to be a lot of steps done before and to achieve the reproducibility. And now we can basically ask different questions here. And I would suggest that you think about three main parts. How it has been described, right? Have we a verbal description of what we did? Or have we a mathematical, or do we have a pure computational description? For example, people might just publish code, right? So there is no verbal description. On the other side, many people or many publications claim that they have reproducibility, but it's not absolutely complete, right? So, and there might be also different things there, is it really complete with respect that the whole analysis pipeline is there? That we can replicate everything, reproduce everything from where you collected the data until the plot in the paper. And the other thing there is, even though the whole analysis pipeline might be there, with respect to some, for example, plots in the paper, you might have different pipelines going on there for your analysis for different parts of the paper. So some might be there, some others might not be there. So that's really the second thing, completeness, we need to talk about. And then as a third thing here is availability, right? So who can actually do the reproducibility, right? So you might have perfect description and everything included in your reproducibility, but you might not have published it. You might not have been able to publish it. And so the question is really here, who can access that reproducibility? Non-trivial question, particularly in the social sciences, since coming back to our Twitter example, or now X example, even seemingly public data, such as X data, cannot be easily shared. So you end up very, very quickly in a situation whereby even by legal or licensing agreements, you are no longer to share all the aspects of your analysis, right? So the claim of reproducibility is really something that is a multidimensional construct at the end of the day, right? So let's talk about the form. We have here verbal descriptions. I have mentioned before, they are really important to give a high-level overview, to give also people that are potentially not into the nitty-gritty, there are some insights. And for today, for example, they might be also very, very interesting, for example, AI to give access to results if they are just there in, or if they are there in human language form. The next thing we have talked about is what you should also include. So these are not exclusive things, but these are different categories, how you publish your finding. And you have the language, the natural language, but you should also, for reproducibility, but also just as general good practice, if there are mathematical formulas, maybe used during your analysis or findings, put them inside. You have to put them inside. And that is basically the mathematical part of reproducibility. But here, the computational part, as a also very, very important thing here, is we want not just humans to understand it, but we want to make it for machines really easy to understand. Just think about it from that perspective. I guess many of you have already been reviewing papers and publications which have computational analysis steps inside. How many of these reviews you did not just read the paper, but really checked if the analysis itself works? And from my personal experience, I can tell it's a close to 0% of people that really gives the whole computational part also, makes it available. But this is really important, since otherwise you cannot verify it, right? So or if you would verify it, you would need to spend there potentially weeks to re-implement potentially the computation aspects. And that's why the sharing of executable code together with the environment descriptions and everything is really so important, right? So human language, pseudocode and mathematical abstraction, but then also the detailed fine-grained implementation, so that computers can help us actually to verify the findings in the paper, right? And but also to build upon. So, right. Completeness of materials, we have talked about that before, right? So there are two dimensions to the completeness of materials. So is the whole process available, or for example, has the whole analysis done and the only thing that's reproducible is to basically do the plotting, right? So you have a final finding data set, so a final output of your analysis pipeline, and only do that plotting, then this is shallow reproducibility, right? But even if you have the deep reproducibility, only parts of your papers, only some parts, sorry, only some parts of your figures, for example, might be fully reproducible. And completeness of materials basically requires both subdimensions there to be present, right? Last but not least, who can actually do any computational reproducibility. So if you remember in the beginning, reproducibility is really about so that the findings become basically independent of the authors, right? And for this, we want to be something, in the best case, in the open verifiable. So everything is out there. The method, it's operationalization via code, but also the data. In case you cannot do that, you might have at least third-party computational reproducibility. What do we mean with that? That means you might not be able to share the data or parts potentially of the code for various reasons, such as privacy, licensing agreement, and so on. But if you submit it to a journal, there might be a data editor and an editor that's specifically focusing on testing reproducibility, acting as a third-party trusted service, and that can check the reproducibility, and then you have that basically the reproducibility established, but external general audience might not be able to do that, right? And the lowest form of sharing and availability is really like that you have the things and you think you can replicate it and have tested that, hopefully replicate it tomorrow. But this always has many things that might go wrong, right? So you might have a dependence, for example, of the code on specifica for your laptop maybe you run it on, right? So, and if someone else would try to execute it, it would completely fail and not work at all, right? So try to be as close as possible to open verifiability, if possible, again, depending on your licenses and rights you have, right? So with these three dimensions being discussed, you should really, at least when you publish something, clearly communicate what kind of reproducibility status have you reached. So what has been shared in terms of form. Is it complete? Are all aspects covered? And who is basically represented? Who can basically receive that shared data and the shared code? And what we are also like working in that area on is to make that communication simpler in the sense that we are aiming at, and I think there are a lot of other parties also trying to do that, aiming at introducing a certification system where we can basically give out certifications that then signal readers what kind of reproducibility status a publication has, and also drive a incentive structure there. So what is typically hindering us in achieving computational reproducibility? So now we have talked about like what it is, what kind of dimensions it has, right? So we had these 3 dimensions, and now let's talk about what keeps us away. Why is it that so few publications we review are really like fully computationally reproducible, right? So why is that the exception rather than the norm if it's so good? And there are quite a number of reasons, and that slide essentially like gives us clusters of reasons, right? So there are technical challenges, obviously. Then there are external dependencies, which might have a technical nature, such as external dependency of an RPE, such as Twitter former, and but also interconnected being actually a technical challenge. Then there might be non-transparency, that it's really unclear what is happening in the code, even if you write there. But actually, one of the most important factors here is also the human factor, right? So it's about introducing the proper incentives, and also like having a common agreements about standards, right? So is it really a shared agreement already that things not just should but are computationally reproducible? And I don't think that there is a full agreement so far, unfortunately. There is everyone easily commits to that this should be the case, but there are only few publications, right, that are actually following these standards. And these challenges are often interconnected. As I said before, for example, a technical challenge might be an external dependency, but then there are also some human factors like, yeah, probably we should not really elaborate too much on that problem. Maybe people will just overlook it, for example. Right, so technical challenges. We have mentioned before, in computational social science, we have really like large data sets, potentially complicated analysis steps, and these all add up. Like, where do I get the storage? These new developments in AI, for example, what kind of hardware requirements are we having? Will my stuff still work if I have developed it on Windows? Will it also work on a Linux machine, for example? Really operating systems. How do I get all the dependencies in all my packages? Like, I might have it installed, I might not even realize that I depend on it, but as soon as someone else runs it, they run into issues since dependencies are not met. And the analysis code and report and findings of your publication or works then are really just the tip of the iceberg, and they depend on a large stack beneath it, right? External dependencies, let's just go that makes it even more, right? So APIs we have talked about, we have like different libraries we might depend on, and these libraries might be like, for example, if you have specific R packages that we need to install, but also like really system relevant packages, like, for example, packages that or dependencies that deal with matrix multiplication, which might be differently implemented on different systems, right? So we might have proprietary or commercial tools that we need to use during analysis. How can we make that really reproducible? And last but not least, these, for example, coming back to the AI question, there are increasingly number of really large models which are, even if you can replicate them like same finding, let's say, or same output, they are at the end of the day completely non-transparent and black box models, right? What I mentioned before is that the human factors are really the big thing, right? So one human factor is reluctance to share, and I can completely understand that. Let me just give one example. I mentioned that only a very small fraction of things that at least I review are actually computationally reproducible. And it's a few cases I have reviewed that were computationally reproducible, or that had at least the option that I could verify that. I actually received, for example, publications, including the code, nicely documented, but then when and even very easy for me to computationally run. But the author or the authors then basically ended up in a situation where they freely shared something that most others have not done, and I found a real problem in the analysis code. So if they would not have done it, they might this problem might have been unseen, and it might not have caused them later on issues during the review. And it's there is really a understandable reluctance to share. And even if people say we should do that, it's a different story if we as a community should do it, or if I myself with my papers should take actually the extra effort. And the best thing that can happen is that I get then rejected, since someone looked very closely into my computational implementations, right? And that's a huge thing. So fear of criticism or is a huge thing that comes there. There's also like extra time one needs to invest to clean that stuff up, and also obviously privacy concerns. A lot of like research builds on data that cannot just be easily shared. And to overcome that, we need to, training is really one of the important things. We need to develop these standards, and also these things need to be communicated. But there is also a further problem in computational social science, namely, I'm highly impressed how well capable social scientists are of writing code, and I can that honestly say as a computer scientist. But one has also to acknowledge that obviously people or researchers that have no formal training in software engineering might not have all the necessary tools available that are necessary to make something completely reproducible on a computational side, right? So just to say that right. And this is an issue which basically limits us there. And the output there is that in many cases we have like code that's published for a publication, for example on GitHub or code sharing platforms such as GitHub, but that code might not be readily accessible to other authors. We see that it's published, but is it really runnable? And how much time basically? Like how high is the bar? If I think that paper is interesting and I want to rerun that, how high of a bar is it to actually rerun? And computational reproducibility means really bringing that bar down, making it accessible, not just publishing it, making it accessible and reproducible for people that are interested. Right. So I had said in the beginning that the reproducibility should be really given if you publish a finding. So that's essentially right, really where you make it available to the others. But obviously that's only the result, and we should plan from the beginning, right? From the design, how we design our work or our studies, how we collect the data, process the data, so all the analysis steps. Are we really like trying to preserve the actual implementations of the analysis step right as we do it, so that we do not have to engineer it post hoc, and that's really important. And then finally include all these implementation steps, and not just some sanitized version of it in our final report that we hopefully archive, not just the paper, not just the data, but also the code and the computational parts of it, right? So I have now talked about how or what would be what are potential issues we run into if we want to strive for computational reproducibility. What I would now like to give really is a short overview about tools that we have that help us to have good practices that make it easy for us to go the way that actually leads to computational reproducibility. And coming really back to the question of form, how we publish something, one good practice that has turned out was literate programming. And what is literate programming? It's basically combining natural language description, so that's the first factor, with code, that's the third factor, that is executable also, and that people can easily test. But also in the natural language description, you can embed really mathematical formulas, right? So it's source code here, that's a strange thing. It's also outputs, it's natural language, and we can really combine that into one document. And literate programming, you can use something like Jupyter, obviously. That's one of the biggest and known standards for that, but there are many, many different standards. Like there used to be something called R Markdown, I think it's now called Quarto, which goes in a very similar direction, and also other languages such as, for example, Julia, have Pluto. There are different options to achieve that. That's literate programming. That's the first thing that can help us really to make it easier to go that way of computational reproducibility. But there were also other questions we had, like for example, how is it with do I have access to the right compute power, right? So how do I make sure, for example, that I have enough time on my local machine to run it? And that's really something where something interesting can happen there. If we are not just having these literate programming notebooks, that's essentially exactly the same we had before, but that we are really thinking on where the computation is happening. And there are increasingly efforts to put that into the cloud. And to make it really easy to have potentially large data sets, a standardized environment, and we can potentially work with actions that are all known to us in the cloud, namely just clicking on a link. What about clicking on a link and then it turns out to be reproducible? And that really contrasts with our typical things there on the personal computer, small data. Every computer is configured a little bit different, and it's extremely takes a long time, at least much longer than just clicking on a link to set something up, right? So again, very few people actually publish their computational artifacts of papers or for papers in a way where it's done within 5 minutes that you can rerun it. Standardized environments. Let's talk about this a little bit. So, so if we use natural language, there is something called meaning as use. It means each word we utter is defined by its use, like how other people use it, how we ourselves used it in the past. But for computers, that meaning is defined essentially in the environment, in the packages in particular, in the program code libraries we build our analysis on, right? So we might use a plotting library, we might write the exact plotting commands in our code, but actually the implementation happens on a deeper step. So we need two things there. First of all, we need to be very explicit about like what is our environment looking like, and we need to enable for different research publications to have different environments. And that's really the second thing that comes in besides cloud, or the third thing besides cloud, literate programming. It's about cloud, literate programming, and being precise about the environment, being really precise that we have like a specific version of NumPy, that matrix multiplication or a plotting library here installed. So looking at the form, literate coding might be an option, right? So creating an integration between text, code, and mathematical formulas if necessary. For larger computations, potentially long running, and also making it easy for others to access that, cloud might be an option. To ensure that something actually runs also in the cloud, being precise how your environment looks like with respect to installed dependency might be an option. And together, all this is heavily used, for example, in online platforms such as MyBinder. And I'm just like mentioning MyBinder since we are participating in that. But this is essentially a platform that allows us to publish these literate programming environments together with natural language, together with code, together with mathematical formulas in such a way that people, all that they need to do is click on a link, and then they are redirected in a virtual environment that lives in the cloud, and they can rerun these analyses again just with one click, but they also can manipulate it a little bit, right? So what happens if I change a little bit of a parameter here or there? How sensitive is it? And we are suddenly also not just talking about reproducibility, but see how the stack builds up from reproducibility to, for example, robustness. How is it robust? And we can start to explore that manually there, right? So building on the shoulders of giants here. Is a web service. The thing here is everyone can use that web service. And you need to limit a little bit like what you put on the web if it's free, since otherwise it's gone, right? So it's a little bit like if you leave goods on the streets, if the bulk of good is too large, someone will come and just scoop it up and it's gone. So with MyBinder, there's a limited availability with respect to resources for no technical reason, but just for the reason that if you would put large resources out there, so for example, large GPUs behind the system, someone would find good use of it and, I don't know, mine Bitcoin or whatsoever. And that's obviously something we do not want to endorse. So there is another service, and that's called Jupyter for NFDI. That's a service within the NFDI. That's a national German data infrastructure, which should basically, or has the aspiration, the audacity, the hope to integrate what we need for data analysis in Germany. And here there is something called Jupyter for NFDI, which is a base service that actually really targets that market where people want to make things computationally reproducible without having to jump through all these hurdles, or having it at least done or achieves it in a as easy as possible way. And I encourage you to check that out. Right, and in particular, since that's part of NFDI and you have to register there, now suddenly we can also put more resources behind it, right? And it's still not the gigabytes or terabytes in VRAM, but you most certainly can contact the people behind Jupyter for NFDI. If you have any special requirements, let them know, and they will try to find an option for that. Last but not least, we have also here internally our method hub. What is that method hub? It's really the idea of what we had before, of having these, let me just jump to the right thing, of having a combination of natural language, code and execution, but not just as an execution service, but really something where you can actually explore resources. So if you would like to have an overview, for example, in the social sciences, about like what kind of methods are available, or maybe there is a tutorial for something you're interested in, the Methods Hub is a great place to start. And it not just gives you that method or tutorial in a static way, but it gives you the option to, if you have found a method, that you click on the link here. I'm not sure if it's visible, but if you click on the right link there, you will be redirected to either MyBinder we had before or Jupyter for NFDI, and it will no longer be just a static website, but a fully interactive environment configured with the right dependencies so that you can replicate and rerun computational, the stuff in these tutorials, experiment with it, change it, and have a low-level entry into available resources, making them computational reproducible, right? Last but not least, I have here an overview about some of the references this is built on. You can check them out once the slides are available. I will make them available within the next days. And with that being said, here at Leibniz Institute we have services. There is a service overview. I would encourage you to check that out. And also, we have heard that this was the last talk in this round. There might be further rounds coming up, and you can learn more here at the upcoming Meet the Experts talk. So, thank you for your attention.